Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Milwaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today, we'll look at how the federal government shutdown is impacting children in Wisconsin. Then, in a new Capitol Notes, we'll learn what some Wisconsin leaders are trying to do to soften the blow. It's
not a matter of there's money laying around to do this. You could argue that you could get the feds to change the rules, but for immediate relief, there isn't immediate relief that's clear other than reopening the government.
Plus, we'll tell you about a tool that helps Milwaukee renters learn about their landlords.
When you apply to rent a unit, the landlord gets all kinds of information about you, but the renter might not even know who the landlord is. They might not even know the name of the LLC they're renting from. They just know where they send the check.
All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. The federal government shutdown has now stretched on for more than a month, and money for some vital services is not being distributed. In Milwaukee County, 125,000 children benefited from food assistance at some point this last year. 2 Head Start child care programs in our state are now poised to close their doors this month. Jenny Maurer is the executive director of Wisconsin's Head Start Association. She joins WUWM education reporter Catherine Kokel to talk about the challenges facing Wisconsin's most vulnerable families.
So I want to start by just introducing people to what Head Start is if they're not familiar or if they've never used the services before. How would you describe Head Start and the impact it has in Wisconsin?
Sure. So Head Start is one of our nation's oldest anti-poverty programs. Actually, this past year, Head Start celebrated its 60th birthday, and Head Start provides services across all the counties in our state, and it provides a number of different services. But I think the program component that is probably most familiar to folks is providing services to 3 to 5-year-olds and their families. And that looks like center-based childcare. And so in addition to those kiddos getting amazing center-based childcare, there are comprehensive services that really wrap around and support the family on goals that they're working on for themselves and that they identify with the support of Head Start staff. So that might be working on finding more stable housing or different jobs or job training opportunities, and then connecting families to things like needed medical or dental care. So really just serving as that launch pad to success for a family. Another thing I really like to point out to folks who maybe aren't familiar with Head Start is that Head Start families are families that are our friends and neighbors. The majority of Head Start families are working parents, so they are working alongside us in our communities. They're working in retail and hospitality. They're working in our hospitals. So they're really a part of our communities. And Head Start is serving roughly 15,000 children and their families across our state. And Head Start is really an economic driver within our community. So not only is Head Start serving children and helping their parents get to work, but Head Start is also employing thousands of staff across our state and buying goods and services in our communities, both in our urban centers in Wisconsin, but also in our rural communities.
And it's worth noting, too, that Head Start services are provided to families for free if they qualify. And so there are income limits that allow a family to qualify. I believe for a family of 4 this year, that was around $32,000. Does that sound right?
Yep, that sounds about right. So there are specific eligibility requirements set forth by the federal government, including the federal poverty guidelines, as well as if a family is eligible for SNAP or food share, as it's called in Wisconsin, a family can be deemed eligible for Head Start through those requirements. There are also a few other eligibility options, ways that families can be deemed eligible for Head Start. But the poverty guidelines or food share are the most common ways that families are deemed eligible for Head Start. And all the Head Start services are free. And it's really serving as that economic springboard to success for so many families in our state.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really helpful explanation. I was actually just looking up this morning. There are about 120,000 kids in Milwaukee County specifically that received food share or our state's version of SNAP food assistance benefits last year. So that is actually just over half of all of the children in Milwaukee County. So, that kind of paints a picture of how much poverty we are dealing with in our county.
Certainly not all of the children who access food share are eligible because of their age, are not eligible for Head Start. That is one way that a family could qualify for Head Start if they're age eligible.
Right. So we are now facing a situation where 2 Head Start centers in Wisconsin are at risk of closing due to the federal government shutdown. Can you explain what that means for almost 300 students?
Yeah, so what that means, it's a little different for each of these 2 programs. So I can talk first about Southwest CAP, so in the southwest part of the state. So for that program, they have made the difficult decision that starting the first week of November, they are going to have to shut down their 9 preschool or Head Start classrooms if this government shutdown continues. So each program has a unique set of budgetary constraints. And as they look at their program situation, they are going to shut down those services until the government reopens. So what that means, first and foremost for children, is that they will not have the program to go to. So that means they won't have that safe and nurturing environment to attend. And often what we know is that that's where they're getting their meals, they're getting their teeth brushed, they're getting those extra hugs and cuddles. And, the kind of secondary impact is that those parents, I started off saying that what we know about Head Start parents is that the majority of those parents are working parents in our communities. And I'm a working parent myself, and I know that if my children's childcare or school is shut down, I really struggle to get my work obligations done. And that's the same for Head Start parents. So those parents will be forced to make really difficult choices.
I've heard people say that the people most impacted by a federal government shutdown are children. Do you agree with that?
I would certainly agree with that statement. I think this government shutdown is really going to hurt children. Children will not have, as I said, a safe place to go. And what we know is that children, especially young children, they can't watch themselves. And we know that children are, thousands and thousands of children are going to suffer in our state with a pause in SNAP benefits. So not just thinking about the impacts on these 2 Head Start programs, it's really going to be catastrophic. But I really think I want to encourage all of your listeners to be thinking about, our entire communities and what this will mean for all of us, because we're all connected, and the ripple effects that this will have across our communities, because children exist in families and families exist in communities, and we're really all connected. So I encourage everyone to think that this not only affects someone else's children, but it affects our entire communities.
That speaks to the point that you're making, that the children who are in Head Start programs have parents who are working in our hospitals and working in hospitality and working in all of these industries that desperately need people to show up for work next week and the weeks after. So how can someone who's listening to this help?
Yeah, I think that there are lots of different ways that folks can be helping. I think that there are lots of ways that folks are activating to support folks in their community. I think that I'm seeing a lot of activation about food drives in communities because I think right now that's going to be a really crushing need. Had lots of discussion with programs that were really worried that kids and their parents are going to go hungry. So I would really encourage folks to reach out to their local food banks, their faith communities that are mobilizing to support the crushing food scarcity that is coming towards us. And I would really encourage folks to reach out to their legislators and let their legislators know that kids and families are struggling right now and that working families are struggling and that we can't think about these issues in isolation, and that how difficult it is to be a low-income working family in Wisconsin, and encourage legislators to think about the ripple effects across our communities. I think that legislators need a dose of reality of what it's like to be a low-income working parent in Wisconsin. And I think that we need to do a better job of communicating what it's like to live in Ashland, Wisconsin, what it's like to live in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, what it's like to live in the city of Milwaukee. And I think we need to let our legislators know they work for us and to communicate with them what it's like to just try to take care of your kids, whether it's in a government shutdown or what it's like in the middle of the summer. We need to let them know how hard folks are working to care for their kids and families, and that Washington needs to do a better job of paving the way for hardworking families in Wisconsin.
Jenny Maurer is the executive director of Wisconsin's Head Start Association. She spoke with WUWM education reporter Catherine Kokel. You can find more coverage about the impact the federal government shutdown is having in Wisconsin at WUWM.com.
This is Capital Notes from Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WizPolitics.com. Hi, J.R. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Okay, so the big political news is still the government shutdown. And to remind people, Republicans currently control both chambers of Congress, but in the Senate, they're short of the 60 votes needed to pass a spending bill that funds the government. That gives Democrats some negotiating power to get the things that they want, like reversing the cuts to Medicaid, renewing Affordable Care Act, tax credits. So far, there's been no consensus to fund the government. And now, in an unprecedented development, the shutdown is affecting SNAP benefits. What should we know about this in Wisconsin, JR?
This is the latest pressure point in this kind of standoff. And if you kind of pull back a little bit and look, Democrats back in March voted for a continuing resolution to keep the government open. And at the time, at least some Democrats did, and at the time there was this unhappiness among their base who felt like they kind of caved to Donald Trump. This time around, as they got closer to the deadline to keep the government open, there's a thought in D.C. from Republicans that, these moderates will cave again and we'll keep it open. Well, that didn't happen. Then there was this thought, there's this No Kings protest in October. Once that passes, they'll cave. And that didn't happen. Now we have SNAP benefits drying up. And they're like, they will cave before that happens. And that didn't happen. So the question is, kind of big question, what's the pressure point or the end game? What's going to finally push this to the point where there is a compromise to open the government? Is it going to be, there are elections in New Jersey and Virginia on Tuesday next week? Is that going to be it? Like once they clear that things will kind of settle down? Is it going to be like air traffic controllers walking off the job because they're not getting paid to bring it to resolution? I don't know. But SNAP is another one of these pressure points where we are seeing real pain inflicted upon the people of this country because our elected representatives can't figure out how to get out of this standoff that they're in.
And 700,000 people approximately in Wisconsin do receive SNAP benefits, and that goes to people with low-income jobs, people who are on fixed incomes, people with disabilities, all sorts of reasons people could be on SNAP. A number of states are actually stepping in to backfill food aid for recipients. That's both Republican and Democratic governors who've declared states of emergency, or they're providing more funding for food banks and pantries, things like that. Why isn't Wisconsin doing that?
Well, the argument from Republicans I've heard so far is like, look, this is a federal program. It's federal money. We should have Democrats reopen the government. And argument from Republicans is, look, all this pain you're feeling right now, citizens, it would go away if we just got, I think, 7 votes from Democrats in the U.S. Senate to reopen the government, or 8, something like that. If you guys just come on board, we can all talk about these things. These subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, SNAP, it'd all be good to go to have this conversation if you just come back to the table. So they don't want to give Democrats kind of a out, if you will. So Mary Felskowski is the Senate president in Wisconsin. She went on up front a week or so ago and said Republican lawmakers are not going to step in and provide state money to backfill this. This is Democrats, hey, you want to end this? Vote to reopen the government. I've seen the suggestion in various places, Governor Evers has all this COVID money laying around. He can just go ahead and reallocate that. Well, according to the rules in the U.S. Treasury for those COVID funds, they had to be obligated by December 31st of 2024 and spent by December 31st of 2026. There isn't much leeway to reallocate those funds. They basically the contracts are out. If you read the Treasury Department rules, there are some examples where, if I were to pay you, let's say $50 million to go do a project and it came in at $48 million as the final bill, I could reallocate that $2 million, but I can't just take money that's now allocated for purpose A and move it to SNAP. That's not allowed in the current rules. Also, a provision of those rules say that if you do repurpose the money, it has to be for an expense on the books by December 31st of 2024. So it's not a matter of there's money laying around to do this. You could argue that you could get the feds to change the rules, but for immediate relief, there isn't immediate relief that's clear other than reopening the government.
And one of the big issues that Democrats are hanging their hat on is the idea of the tax credits for the Affordable Care Act. Democratic Governor Tony Evers announced this past week that the cost for healthcare coverage purchased on healthcare.gov in Wisconsin will rise for some people by anywhere from 45% to 800% in 2026, depending on where a person lives. Republicans on their side say that the ACA is unsustainable. What impact are you expecting this to have in the whole conversation?
Great question, because every time something comes up in this conversation, there's not a sign of movement from Democrats or give from Republicans. So again, Republicans keep saying, you want these tax credits, these subsidies extended? Open the government and we'll talk. Democrats keep saying, we want you to extend the subsidies as part of opening government. And nobody's blinking right now. We've seen these shutdowns before. Eventually, it seems like there's kind of like this group will break away and say, here's our bipartisan way to get out of it. We're not seeing just yet that big push of, here's our path out, and people are digging in. So now at some point, you do think there'll be something's going to happen. Something's going to give at some point. But who's going to give and who's going to be blamed for all this? If you go look at the Marquette poll, for example, from last week, a small plurality of voters blame more Republicans than Democrats. Now, some also blame everybody, right? But you can be sure that politicians are keeping an eye on those polls to say who's winning the messaging battle on this, because that's important to them in terms of, hey, we have the high road here. We're good to stand our ground, or, hey, we're losing ground. We should probably think about doing something different.
You're tuned into Capitol Notes. I'm WUWM's Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WizPolitics.com. I wanted to touch back on something that happened a couple weeks ago, or the news came out. There was a year-long investigation by a Cap Times reporter that uncovered that between 2018 and 2013, nearly 200 school employees were investigated for sexual misconduct and grooming. But that information isn't easily available to the public, and the Cap Times found that 1/3 of those investigated voluntarily surrendered their teaching license but could go on to work with children in other settings. Wisconsin State Superintendent Dr. Jill Underly has received some blowback over these discoveries and for her response or lack thereof. What's the latest on this story?
So Underly, there was a hearing before the Assembly Committee in which they went over this story and what was in it. Underly wasn't there. She graduated from Indiana University for undergraduate. She got a Distinguished Alumni Award the same day as the hearing. People I talk to will say, hey, we understand this is a big award. You want to be there, but your job, your paycheck is paid for by taxpayers. Your responsibility is to be there to answer these questions. She didn't go, not a great look. Now we're going to have 2 hearings in this coming week before 2 separate committees that shall have a chance to answer these questions. Expect Republicans to be pretty sharp in their questioning. Even Democrats weren't happy when she didn't show up for that hearing in the Assembly. So she's still got some political treacherous waters to get through here before this thing is cleared up.
I was also wondering about, since we've got another Supreme Court race coming up next year, and the Supreme Court's always been on the minds of Wisconsin voters, there's actually been an uptick in threats against judges, partially because of the 2020 election when then candidate Donald Trump refused to concede that he lost the election. A man was even charged with stalking after he allegedly sent intimidating emails to Wisconsin Justice Jill Karofsky. There's been an increase in credible threats against federal judges and Wisconsin state judges. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, so Karofsky did a event with us at westpolitics.com recently in which he talked about the level of support they have now. So the court has a marshal's office. They have it's called a full-time equivalent position. Basically, it's 1.6 full-time equivalents. There's 2 people, one's part-time. The governor has been using federal COVID funds to pay for an additional 4 Capitol Police to provide security to the Supreme Court and the court system in general. In the budget, for a second time, the Supreme Court asked for expansion of the marshal's office. They want to go from that 1.6 full-time equivalents to 10 full-time equivalent jobs, arguing that it was needed to provide security for not just the Supreme Court, but for the court system in general. Republicans rejected it. Now that ARPA money, the federal COVID money, runs out August of next year for those 4 additional positions. Karofsky said that she is working with lawmakers on both sides to find more money to keep those positions going. She's optimistic. Republicans have rejected that bigger marshal's office, the 10-person marshal office, because they didn't want the court to have a quote-unquote police force under its watch. So keep an eye on this as it develops. Will we see more resources dedicated to the court to keep these jobs going or to add more positions for protection than what's going on nationally?
Where is Wisconsin sort of falling when it comes to these threats for judges? Are we sort of more of a hotbed for this? Are there things that have raised flags here more than elsewhere?
I haven't seen national numbers for the states. We saw some numbers this spring. So when the Budget Committee for Legislature was considering the request for the expanded security force, marshal's office with the Supreme Court, Fiscal Bureau, which is the nonpartisan budget arm of the legislature, does analysis, noted that there had been an uptick in threats. They kind of went up after 2020, died down a little bit, are back on the upswing. So I haven't seen full numbers for 2025 yet, but the early ones through March were close to all of last year. So not great. And you can't forget there was a judge a year or 2 ago who was executed in his own home by a man who was sentenced by that judge previously. So there's been definitely some cause for concern with judges in Wisconsin. They're looking for additional security.
And on the courthouse legal beat, sort of finally a 2026 midterms check-in, Democrat Josh Kaul is running for re-election as Attorney General. He now has an opponent in Fond du Lac District Attorney Eric Toney, a Republican. What should we know? It's kind of a rematch of 2022.
Yeah, now there's still time for others to run. Eric Toney had a primary in 2022 that didn't help him in the general election. It looks like he's done a good job of shoring up support among Republicans, that he might avoid a primary this time, but don't rule that out. The big questions are going to be, what's the environment going to be like in 2026? I mentioned Trump and his numbers before. If Trump's numbers are not great, it's tougher for Republicans in general. Eric Toney has run once before. He served as president of the Wisconsin District Attorneys Association. He's going to have lots of support from his fellow DAs, most likely. Josh Cull's got some vulnerabilities, whether it's slower turnaround times for processing samples at the state crime lab, whether it's his fights against the Trump administration. So really, though, the top of the ticket will probably derive a lot of things. What's the environment like, i.e., where's Donald Trump? And that governor's race, do Democrats, Republicans both have a strong candidate? Does one have the advantage? Does they may run away with that race? That's going to impact down ballot next fall. We're a ways away, but the stage is set for a rematch. And again, the top of the ticket and the environment is going to influence that race dramatically.
All right. Thanks for the analysis, JR. And thanks for joining me on Capital Notes.
Anytime.
Just like Capital Notes, Lake Effect can also be found as a podcast. Search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcasts to download and listen on demand. In about 15 minutes, we'll talk about bad movies and what can make them so fun to watch. But first, we'll tell you about a tool that can help Milwaukee renters learn about their landlords. That's coming up on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Milwaukee has some unfortunate statistics when it comes to landlords in the city. There are thousands of properties owned by out-of-state landlords. About half of the city's rental properties are owned by a very small number of landlords, and in most cases, that drives up rent. So if you're a current renter or looking for a new rental property, it's more important than ever to do your research before deciding where to live. And there's a tool that can help. LandlordMapper.org has created a database of Milwaukee landlords and the properties they maintain. John Johnson is one of the creators of the tool, and he joins me to talk about it. John Johnson, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here.
So how does the Landlord Mapper work? Walk us through the process of searching a property.
Yeah, so you can go to our website and put in the address of any rental property in the city of Milwaukee, just the city limits, and it'll tell you some information about that property, how much it's worth. It'll also tell you the other properties owned by that landlord and the other companies that are connected to that landlord. So large landlords, even some small landlords, often use a different LLC to own their different properties, sometimes one property per LLC. And so if you're just sort of naively looking at the data, it's very difficult to tell what a given landlord actually owns and the way that they behave across those properties. And so our tool does a network analysis of the names and addresses that are within these, what we call landlord networks, combines all of those together and gives you statistics for them. We calculate the eviction filing rate that those landlord networks have, the code violation rate, and the total value of the properties they hold.
Sure. Now, how do you get this kind of information? Because as you say, each property might have its own LLC. A lot of this kind of data can be pretty opaque when you're just looking through it.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of programming that happens on the back end. It updates every weekday. It pulls the latest property records from the city assessor's office. So that's our source of truth for who owns properties. That gets updated perhaps a month after a sale takes place. It varies based on the time of year, but they keep it pretty updated. And then we've built an open source code workflow that you can go and look at on GitHub if you're a nerd who's curious about this stuff. And then every 3 months or so, we go in and add new eviction data and code violation data.
What would you say you've learned so far about Milwaukee landlords?
Two things. One is that If you think of the typical landlord, if you just have all the landlords and you randomly choose one of them, probably that landlord is very small. They might only own one rental property. There are many, many landlords in the city who only own one property or maybe two properties besides the house they live in. But if you were to pick a renter at random, probably that renter rents from a quite large landlord. There's a handful of really large landlord networks that own 40% of the properties in the city. The largest of them, Barada, uses over 100 LLCs, as best I can tell. So depending on the perspective you have, if you're thinking about the landlords that exist, you'll think, well, this is a market that has a lot of small actors in it. But if you're thinking about the experience that tenants are having, actually there's a handful of landlords in the city who control an awful lot of the supply that exists there. And we see that landlords behave in very different ways, one company to another. Some of them file evictions constantly, and we see a lot of serial eviction filing. So they'll do it, on the 5th day of the month if they haven't paid rent yet, just sort of as a matter of course, whereas other landlords will, only file evictions when they really mean it. And we see that most of their eviction filings actually lead to an eviction order instead of just being a sort of routine part of the rent collection process. The amount of code violations varies a lot between landlords. Some of them keep their houses in better repair than others. And we suspect, though we don't have the data on this yet, that the sort of level of rents and the aggressiveness with which a landlord raises rents varies a lot between companies. But that's really difficult to get data on. We don't collect good data on rents in this country. And so I'm hoping to do more research on that in the future. This sort of work gives us the ability to understand how much consolidation is happening in the rental market, which before was kind of a mystery. We know that Barada is a large landlord because you see lots of properties in town that have those boulders around them or have a sign that says Barada Properties out in front. But it's not like there's one company that actually legally owns all those properties. And so it took a project like this to really figure out how large is that group of companies.
Yeah, when you say consolidation, what does that mean? Does that mean, there's a landlord who has all of these different LLCs and that's kind of, going under one umbrella? What does consolidation look like in this context?
Yeah, exactly that. So, my research question is, what share of the rental apartments in the city are owned by, let's say the largest 5 landlords or something like that. So we're working on a project now to try to understand, is there pricing power in that market? Is there a level of consolidation that would kind of cause the competition that we expect to keep prices down in a market not to be happening? TBD, we're still working on that project, but it's the kind of thing that we're able to do now that we're able to link landlords in this way. And then also the service we've made is designed to be a tool for tenants. Maybe you would prefer to have a large landlord because you think they'll offer prompter service, or maybe you'd prefer to have a small neighborhood landlord. This is a tool you can use to understand the size and complexity of the corporation you're renting from.
I think that really gets to the larger question of, what are the ways that tenants or prospective tenants can use this tool and the information it provides? What can they do with that?
Yeah, I recommend anyone who's looking for apartments to use this tool to just understand more about who they might be renting from, because when you call the number you see on the listing, that might just be a property management company, or you might not really understand the relationship that person you're talking to on the phone has to the ownership of the house you're looking at. And this way you can see, is this just a small landlord who only owns this property or only owns a couple properties? Or is this part of a corporate web of, dozens of LLCs that all share a PO box in California? You'll see examples of that sometimes. And while that in itself can't tell you, is this a good landlord or a bad landlord, based on your past experiences, you might have preferences for a certain kind of landlord. And then also we do show eviction filing rates and code violation rates for those landlord networks. We redact the eviction information for individual properties that only have a few units, but when there's, a larger number of units in a network, we'll tell you what that rate is, which might be useful information for some renters.
What do you hope to achieve as you're getting more information for this database? What are some of your goals for this tool personally?
Yeah, well, one goal is what we were just talking about, to let renters understand more about their landlords. As it is, when you apply to rent a unit, the landlord gets all kinds of information about you. That background check is pretty extensive, but the renter might not even know who the landlord is. They might not even know the name of the LLC they're renting from. They just know where they send the check. And so this is, I wouldn't say it evens the playing field, but it at least gives a little bit more information to a renter about what they're getting into. Then we have this set of research questions we want to answer to understand more about the market dynamics that are shaping the rental market in Milwaukee. And that has potentially some important policy consequences. I often have discussions with people who assume that a large corporate landlord would actually be better than small landlords, because in sort of an Econ 101 model, the thinking goes that a large landlord would be able to charge cheaper rents because they're spreading the risk over more properties. And so it's the risk is more manageable, and they should be able to pass those savings on to renters, and that a large company would be more professional in the way that it responded to complaints and maintained properties than maybe a small part-time landlord would be. And there's a way in which, as a theory, that might make sense, but pretty much all the evidence that I've seen is the opposite, that actually small landlords tend to provide a higher quality tenant experience, to raise rents less aggressively, to file evictions at a lower rate, to only file evictions when they actually intend to reclaim the property in breach of contract rather than as just part of the rent collection process, and various other things that other researchers have found that a sort of neighborhood landlord tends to offer a higher quality experience. But it's only through rigorously answering those questions in an empirical way that I think we can say, okay, these are the kinds of landlords we want to encourage more of, and these are the kinds that we want to avoid in our city. And that matters for the kinds of building code updates or zoning code updates that the city might pursue. For example, there's a discussion in the city right now about making it easier to build accessory dwelling units, so like replacing your garage with a small housing unit. And most of those would be rentals. So it would be good to know, are sort of small-time landlords a good experience for tenants overall, in which case having a lot of these ADUs would be a good thing. In contrast, maybe we think that tenants could have the best experience renting from a large landlord in an apartment building, in which case, there's things the city could do to promote that. So answering those kinds of questions about what creates the best tenant experience is a goal for this project.
All right. John, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect.
Thank you.
John Johnson is a research fellow at Marquette Law School's Lubar Center and one of the creators of landlordmapper.org. We spoke last fall. WUWM is seeking solutions to the systemic housing problems in Milwaukee. You can find those stories at wuwm.com/housing. Coming up, we'll learn some of the ways trash cinema pushes boundaries that are both distasteful and important. That's next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Have you ever seen a movie so bad it's good? Some call that trash cinema. A bad or trashy film might seem like a waste of a viewer's time, but they can actually have historical, societal, and cultural significance. In fact, UW-Milwaukee Director of Film Studies, Jocelyn Sapaniak-Galice, has a whole class dedicated to the genre. She says that trash films push boundaries, embrace shock value, and take on the taboo. To help us understand what makes a movie trash cinema, Sapaniak-Galice joins Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski.
We think about trash typically as being something low budget, something that looks a little amateurish, something that doesn't quite fit into standard mainstream approaches to film. The way that I like to think about trash cinema is that it's a little bit tasteless. So it's something that sort of pushes the boundaries of good taste and makes us question whether we even should be watching it, or perhaps most saliently, tell anybody that we watched it at all.
So this is something I was just thinking about. Do you think there's a difference between a B movie and trash cinema?
I do. And part of that, I think, would be about this notion of taste. So when I talk about trash cinema, I'm always actually secretly providing some kind of a philosophical approach to how we think about taste cultures and how taste is not something natural. Right? Like the thing that you like, you don't just like it because you like it. You like it because you're educated in a certain way, because you're in a certain class, often a certain race, even a certain gender, a certain nationality, right? So our tastes are shaped by all these different ideologies and experiences that we have. Therefore, a B movie, that's not always really the appropriate parameters of trash, because we can look at something like Showgirls, which is not a B movie. There was actually a significant amount of budget invested in that film, but that is wholeheartedly trash. And it's because it's so much about what are the boundaries of good taste and what are also the boundaries of vulgarity and what's appropriate on screen.
Yeah, so to dive into that a little bit more, as you say, one big component of trash cinema is pushing those boundaries in a distasteful but, important way sometimes as well. So you mentioned vulgarity. What other kind of boundaries are we talking about when it comes to trash cinema?
Vulgarity is a really easy one to point to, right? Like trash cinema is often kind of obscene, right? It's something that that we really don't, we don't want children to watch it. We don't want like anybody who's in like a proper sophisticated kind of art situation to watch it. But it's not just vulgarity, right? You're right. In fact, and this is really important for thinking about trash, because trash operates outside mainstream boundaries and outside respectability, it can also take on certain elements of things that maybe don't seem like they would be entirely socially appropriate at the time, such as issues around queerness. So I think in particular about Ed Wood Jr.'s film, Glen or Glenda, which is released in 1953. And that film, it's really amateurish, it's really low budget, it's really kind of only halfway narrative, but it takes on issues of being trans and the story of Christine Jorgensen, who was a really well-known trans celebrity in the 1950s, and really kind of excavates what that experience is like, which is extremely rare for a film in 1953. So even though that's not a super vulgar movie, even though, it's a low budget, we wouldn't quite put it as a B movie because it's more independent, it operates outside the boundaries of the mainstream and thus can make us think about certain social issues that also exist outside of the mainstream.
One thing that trash cinema does give us that benefits what we may consider, depending on your test, like, the golden standard of cinema, the ones in the canon, the AFI 100 list, all this good stuff, is the role of tropes. And you say without trashy cinema and the tropes that come with it, we wouldn't have these big, successful, well-regarded movies of today. Can you touch upon that?
Sure. What seems trashy at any moment in time is what operates outside the borders of propriety, right? Like what polite society feels okay talking about or okay discussing. And those borders are constantly shifting, right? Mm-hmm. We're constantly pushing against what is socially appropriate to discuss, but also what is stylistically or aesthetically appropriate to show. So I think about something like Herschel Gordon Lewis's films. He made he's kind of like the king of splatter films. He made films like Blood Feast in the early 1960s, which is it's just gore. It's just like pure gore. That's it. It's just gore. There's really nothing else going on. It's it's just like a kind of celebration of like how much gore can we throw at the screen. If Herschel Gordon Lewis hadn't done that, we then wouldn't have additional kind of approaches to gory movies that are things like Night of the Living Dead at the end of the 1960s, which at this point is a totally canonical film, right? That is totally canonical. But without Herschel Gordon Lewis's super amateurish, super out there outre approach to filmmaking, that movie really wouldn't have been possible. And of course, people like Quentin Tarantino, he uses so many elements of earlier trashy movies, whether it's movies like Switchblade Sisters, which was a film that he really celebrated, or kind of Hong Kong action movies that exist on the periphery, at least, in the 1990s when Quentin Tarantino was starting up. He takes on a lot of those elements and makes them socially acceptable, turns them actually into Oscar-nominated films. But it's all coming from a celebration and a love of trash.
I'd love to talk about how people see trash film or once saw trash film. So we're ranging from 1950s before up to the 90s today. What's its place in small movie theaters? What was the start of it? Was it like an underground scene? Ultimately, can you explain the genesis before today, where we can simply search and see if we can stream it somewhere, or a random trash thing is uploaded to YouTube in a channel dedicated to trash cinema?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So that's a huge question because, but it's also a question I'm delighted by because I am an exhibition historian and that's my specialization. So I often look at the roots of trash cinema in, about the very early 1930s, although we can really locate it a bit earlier than that too. But the early 1930s is when exploitation cinema becomes something really, really popular. The term exploitation does not actually come from people being exploited or ideas or, social mores being exploited. It actually comes, our best guess is that it comes from the kind of advertising that was used for this particular kind of film. And that kind of advertising is also based on a kind of Carnival Barker approach, right? Like somebody who's like, come in, one and all, see this crazy sideshow and check out what's happening. So exploitation films, they were often positioned as educational films. They were only vaguely educational, but they could use that then to provide all sorts of sort of gory details, from everything from like actual footage of childbirth, right, to images of nudity, all under the guise of something educational. An exploitation film would show in theaters that were like on the wrong side of the tracks sometimes, right? Like things that were not quite the fancy downtown theaters, or sometimes exploitation cinema would be shown in a process called four-walling, and that would be renting out some kind of a theatrical space that was really underused, showing your film really quickly, and then kind of taking off after the weekend of showing. So there's a really long legacy of showing trashy, unacceptable, kind of edgy films in places that typical members of polite society would not necessarily go. So then if we skip forward a bit into the 1970s in particular, we get wonderful examples of midnight screenings. And this is, I think, what we all think about now as like this golden era of trash cinema, which is the 1970s. Of course, trashy cinemas would show at drive-ins, but they would also show at theaters like the Elgin, which is one of my very favorite theaters. It was in New York, and the Elgin showed both art house movies and then would show trashy kind of out there movies at midnight. So there's a great tradition of showing trash in moments where you wouldn't see a kind of normal, acceptable film, and that adds to the cachet of seeing a trash movie.
I have to think that another component of that is word of mouth, right? Because people can't come to, these off-the-road theaters unless they know what's happening. And the shock value of the trash cinema is what gets people to talk about it and then continue to show it, right?
You're exactly right, Audrey. That is how the Elgin understood marketing. They knew that in order to make a midnight movie phenomenon, you could advertise it to a certain amount, but you really had to get people talking about it. You have to get the right cool people talking to the right other cool people. And so it's those kind of informal networks of distribution that add to a film's cult status and can transform a film from something trashy into something that gets kind of trash canonized. Or on the other hand, something arty that gets a little bit trash canonized. So I'm thinking here about something like Eraserhead, which is, now we think of David Lynch as whoa, it's David Lynch. He's Mr. Art movie, right? But when Eraserhead came out, people didn't know what to do with it. And they were really disturbed and upset about it. By showing it at the Elgin and encouraging certain audiences to see it, and then encouraging those audiences to talk to other audiences about it, that film in particular then became the sort of cult phenomenon tied to art phenomenon that it still is today.
So even if some movies are made in bad taste and, of course, push boundaries or sometimes are just really awful, what's the cultural significance and societal significance of this genre?
Oh, wow. There is so much significance in trash that we've been kind of unwilling to recognize for so long because we're so obsessed with markers of quality, right? And so much of that has to do with film and mass media in general's excision from the realm of high art for so long, right? I mean, that's not true anymore, but for decades and decades, film struggled to be a part of that kind of like high art hierarchy. Trash manages to disrupt that hierarchy, right? It says that maybe what is high art is not the only thing that's of value. In fact, we can find so many diamonds in this dirt of trash cinema. And when we sift through it, we can discover so much more about what's actually happening in society writ large, what ideologies are really being talked about, what people are afraid of, what people are maybe titillated by. There's all sorts of things that we can sort of parse out when we start really looking at how trash functions. And that is true for a lot of trash cinema. It's why it's so important to look to it and begin to understand it, because we can see so many more elements there that couldn't be addressed in more standard normal film.
Certainly a lot to dig into, but Jocelyn, I want to thank you so much for sharing some of it with me today.
Yeah, thank you.
Jocelyn Sapaniak-Galiz is an associate professor of English and Film Studies and the director of Film Studies at UW-Milwaukee. She spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski. And that wraps up today's show. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It's known as the vampire fish, and it's as gross and terrifying as it sounds. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll tell you about the efforts to keep invasive sea lampreys out of the Great Lakes, and why federal funding cuts are impacting those efforts. Thanks so much for joining us right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM. Milwaukee's NPR.